morning, University of Wisconsin. Thank you so much for having me. So for the next hour, I'm going to share some thoughts with you about words I put on the board. So please jot these down because I'm going to go through some of them and I'm going to create a context and I'm going to explain how my work speaks to some of these issues. While I'm trying to address the problem of underrepresentation, you can have my seat. I'm not going to use it. Yeah. There we go. Such a community. So, I'm very interested in the issue of underrepresentation of people of color and erasures of underrepresented people of color. So I'm talking very specifically about African American, Latinx, and Indigenous people. So protected class people. In the context of science, we understand that underrepresented people are consistently, for structural reasons, but also psychosocial reasons, are often being pushed out of the sciences. So we have to identify these specific obstacles that are consistently keeping us out of the work because there are significant consequences and implications for this particular problem. So some of my work speaks to these issues in a variety of ways. So the fun part of this presentation is that I'm going to get to show you some of my work. So in addition to these keywords up here, I just want to make a couple of announcements. I would be thrilled if you would communicate with me through my Twitter handle. So at @filmprof Rhode Island, I would be interested in hearing your observations or questions or seeing, I don't know, a cat on a Roomba eating a cracker or whatever. That's good stuff too. And also a conference alert if you're interested in science communication at my university. So I'm from the University of Rhode Island, and we host this, I think, a cutting-edge conference about inclusive science communication and how we're trying to use science communication as a way to re-engineer or reverse engineer the problem of systemic racism. Let's just be honest about what it is in the sciences. So if you're interested in this topic, check it out. We had the conference for the first time, so it was the inaugural event last September. It will again be held at the University of Rhode Island for 2 days. And yes, I would encourage you to attend. It is a very good conference, especially for graduate students. Okay, so all that stuff out of the way. So my topic, this is the title. This is also part of the title of my latest film. So my colleague here, who used to be one of my roommates from college, and by the way, there are 2 former roommates. What are the odds? This is very creation weird. But 2 former roommates from my undergrad. So I went to college in the 80s. I'm old. But that doesn't mean they're old, even though we were there together. Professor Scove, she invited me here today, so I want to thank her for being just the most wonderful person in the world, but also for the invitation to give me this experience and to bring me to your community. And also my freshman year roommate, Dr. Rachel Mooney, whose lab is around the corner, and I haven't seen her since, can I say 1989? Ouch. Okay, we got to do better. Anyway, so this is part of the title of my film, and I'll show you a clip. Can we talk difficult conversations with underrepresented people of color? But it also gets at another issue, which is the sense of belonging. That sense of belonging. When you feel like you are at home, you are at peace, you are embraced, you are loved, you are cared for, you are nurtured, you are mentored in such a way that it feeds your future work. And then the students that you mentor after you, belonging. Now, what we're learning is that belonging is a critical problem for everybody, but it is a critical issue specifically for underrepresented people of color. And for this very reason, a lot of people of color and other marginalized people as well don't feel like there's a sense of home or nurturing or warmth or inclusion. So they leave. We leave. Okay? It's such a simple thing to do to provide a sense of belonging. And yet, for some reason, we consistently fail at this problem. So part of my work is to help identify this, to problematize around it, and talk about potential solutions. So that is my latest film, and it is contextualized in a greater body of work. So I'm going to explain how I come to this work, because I use film in particular. So the objective of our conversation today is to explore how science communication, and film in particular, can help dismantle systems and structures that exclude people of color. So I'm using film to identify this particular problem, but also give voice to people who have historically and consistently been erased from the narrative and consistently erased from the fixing up the problem, okay? So erasure. So there's an erasure in the sciences, but then there's an erasure of our identities and our knowledges and our different frameworks. So if you're a person of indigenous descent, which I am, I find that we have different ways of understanding and seeing and looking at issues. One of the key things that we operate from is a place of intuition, which doesn't seem to have a place in traditional Western science. Do you agree with me? So what I'm getting at is that there's what we call Western European frameworks of doing things, right? Taxonomizing, organizing, putting in the boxes, thinking in terms of data, right? There's no place for emotionality, right? There's no place for subjectivity in that. There's no place for intuition, right? So what that essentially says to people of color like me, also as a Black woman, we operate on intuition all the time. Let me tell you, two Black women in a room, we can have a full-on conversation just facially. Right? Indigenous people, same way. Latinx, same way. We have a knowledge that is bodily. Is there a home in science for a bodily kind of knowledge? Probably not. This might be foreign to a lot of you, but if you're a person of color, you understand what I'm saying. Okay? So we have different knowledges, we have a different construction of being, right? But Western mechanisms do not acknowledge nor legitimize these things. So how are you going to have a sense of belonging in a place that is erasing essentially who you are and how you exist? So coming to work every day for people of color is exhausting. It is painful. And then we tell ourselves, because everybody else is telling us, you don't belong here. What are you doing here? Every single one of us has an anecdote and a story that has etched inside of us to our very core. Sometimes it compels us in good ways, and sometimes it drains all the energy out of your soul and makes it hard to get to work every day. Is this a good thing? It isn't. And I have to raise this so that you all acknowledge the unsaid things that might be happening in a room. It's perseverating at all times, right? And yet we don't have the language for it. We don't have a certain level of consciousness or awareness. We haven't talked enough about this. And this is really what communities need to be doing at all times. People of color, what do you think we do? As soon as we get together, what are we talking about? We get right into those stories. I've had 10 conversations already this morning with other women of color about these things. Okay? It's a constant conversation, right? But as a community, it needs to be happening at all times for us to break down these barriers and issues. Okay? So I pulled this really great quote. I love Twitter. I'm such a stalker on Twitter. But I love this. This woman said, so if you don't understand how your science fits into the structures and systems already in play, you're doing science and society a disservice. As a scientist, I believe you have an obligation to examine how your work affects these systems so that you can do the greatest good, right? So you're not just doing science, you're doing it all, right? The greatest good, you're elevating humanity, you're raising consciousness. Okay, if you're ooey-wooey like me, you're raising the vibration of the planet, right? So it's not just I'm in my lab trying to figure out how A works with B and then the. It's beyond that. But you really need to be willing to open yourself up to the more that you are doing. How is your work speaking and how you're doing the work speaking to adjusting the structure? Are you even thinking about the structure? Okay? The structure is limited. The structure reproduces erasure. It is not inherently inclusive or embracing of all, and it should be, right? Everything should be embracing of all. Not the bad, and not Scott Walker, but, right? The good stuff that's gonna move us forward, right? So, how do we know that there's low diversity in the sciences? We know this? Yes, we do, okay? Representation of people of color in the sciences is somewhere around 9 to 13%. The numbers are significantly low, right? And you can draw a line from low representation of people of color to low and poor service received for people of color in the field, okay? So I think about the issue right now around Black female mortality, right? So Black women having babies in hospitals are dying at an astronomical rate, right? And so my question is, well, who are those doctors? How are they talking to the women of color? What kind of services do they give? The doctors are not giving the right kind of service to Black women. They're not asking the right questions. They're undermining even their own independence around their own situation. They're disregarding their intelligence, saying, what do you know about your body? Even my own doctor said to me, you really don't know. I'm the doctor. I'm the one that went to medical school. Right? It's just so condescending. And yet, a real consequence here is that women are dying, and their babies are dying too. Okay? So we're seeing significant disparities around health, right? So there are other issues. So the one that I mentioned before, that we use Eurocentric methods and we don't ingest or we don't include other methods, specifically indigenous methods, right? Especially the sciences that are dealing with Earth. I mean, how can we? How arrogant, right? That we're not using traditional methods. There's also a limit on emotionality and subjectivity in the scientific methods too, so I've also talked about this. But this has a really significant legacy, especially for Black people, because really at the core of the justification for slavery and abuses to follow is that Europe had to convince the world that Black people don't feel emotion and they are devoid of subjectivity. And once you convince people that somebody doesn't feel pain, how are they going to treat you? Right? You will enslave somebody if you think they don't feel pain or if they don't feel emotion. So now you can understand half of what the rationale or reasoning was behind that. Right? So this is unacceptable that we let this exist in our work. We need to learn how to embrace our own emotionality, our own complexity, our own subjectivity, especially now knowing how it's been used against us, right? Low engagement with underrepresented people of color is connected. So at my institution, you know what they say? Students of color come in and the faculty, predominantly white males, will say, well, they just can't do science. And they're so emotional about the problems. So let's just send them to the humanities and then they can do something over there. It happens all the time. Why are they so upset about problems? Can't they just do the math? Can't they just do the science? Really? It's egregious to me. So I use this term colonized because I think that's what it is. It really follows the same construction of colonization, if you think about it. The erasure of subjectivities, a disrespect for different kinds of knowledges, an unwillingness to embrace all narratives, right? That's colonization. So my argument is that we need to decolonize science. We have to get at that stat. Understood? So in addition, here's some other things. How does this look? So more inclusive teaching practices. So at my university also, people in the sciences are like, well, I'm just going to teach science the way that I've been teaching it for 40 years, and people are either going to get it or they're not going to get it. Science doesn't change, right? But then I had a student come up to me, and she's Latinx, Black Latinx, Dominican woman. She's in my film. She said, I was sitting there taking these bio classes thinking, this isn't my place, and then my Black biology professor brought up this story about Henrietta Lacks. You guys know the story, bio people, right? How she was taken advantage of, typical bullshit that happens, right? So her cells were used, and then used and used and used. Her family given no credit. The student heard that story, and that little granito, like that little grain for her was like, oh, no they didn't. They didn't do that to Henrietta Lacks. I'm gonna stay in biology, and I'm gonna try to address this problem. That little story compelled her to stay in. It doesn't take much, right? So you need to be willing in your teaching practice, and in your everyday practice, really, to be willing to listen to other stories, include them in your global storytelling, because you don't know how that's resonating. But it amounts to inclusion. It does, right? And it shifts the culture. So we need to address something that has been exclusionary and structurally and psychosocially meaning, talking about belonging, exclusionary, by practicing better inclusive teaching practices. Okay, so how else do we see this happening? So I'm doing a film right now, Fear of the Blackface. So a colleague of mine who is at MIT is doing work around artificial intelligence. I don't know if you know this, but she's working around how artificial intelligence doesn't recognize black people. So if you guys read these articles where she's trying to understand how is it that when you do a facial scan, these robots can't see black faces. But if you look at the literature, and so I got a PhD in philosophy and cultural studies, and I did a lot of research on this, and I was shocked to find out that there's a long legacy to this problem, right, in every space. And it is in fact true that you will see in the literature consistently philosophers say all black faces look alike. Like we just sort of say it as a meme, like a joke, but if you look at the Enlightenment and you read like Immanuel Kant and Hume and all of those other famous white philosophers who we all herald, right, you will find out that they created race, they constructed race. They sat down and they were like, okay, we're going to designate 5 races, and this is what their competencies are. At the very top, the purest of the pure, it's not just white people, so white people are second, according to Kant. At the top are Germans. Okay, and if you're German, don't go like this. Not good, too soon. Who's down here? Black people. So Kant said, they're inferior, they're not deserving of personhood, they don't feel pain, they're not emotional, they're not smart. Right? So then you start to wonder, why are cops killing unarmed black men? Well, if you've been trained to believe that we are of low intelligence and we don't experience subjectivity or emotionality and we aren't deserving of personhood, like, killing is not all that hard, right? Also, the inability to see the face, because when you can see the face of a creature, you connect with it, especially through the eyes. But if you can't do that, if you can't or are unwilling to do it, it's problematic for our society, because guess what? It shows up in our science. So there's an implicit bias in the algorithms, right? So the people who are creating these algorithms are coming from that place. I can't see the difference in black faces. So she's Nigerian, and she heard this problem, and she's like, I'm here. Just like the student in this story, she's like, I'm gonna fix this problem. I'm gonna write those algorithms so that AI can see black and African faces, period. And that's what she's doing at MIT, and she is brilliant. Okay? Well, why do we have to go through the torture of that? Why do we have to do all that emotional labor, right? And shouldn't other people be in there already working on this? Nobody was really thinking about it in the way that she was, okay? Same issue here, algorithms of compression, similar to this, but on the internet. boy, oh man, worst day ever typing in, okay, black girls. Oh, what comes up will ruin you. If you're a black girl, it will absolutely ruin you. So the algorithms around black identity in particular is really just gross, oppressive, and disgusting. The internet apparently thinks we're all porn stars, right? Great. Do they think that they are full professors with PhDs? No, they don't. Okay? So I try to deal with some of these problems. Here's a shot, actually. Before I go on, I should start showing you clips of my films. These are my colleagues from the Inclusive SciComm workshop. This is a graduate student, Megan Lubetkin, who does science communication. And if you're interested, check her out at the University of Rhode Island, and that's her Twitter. So science is done by people, and people are subjective. Communication and teaching science must be more inclusive. So Catalina and Brian Dewsbury doing something called the Privilege Walk. So if you come to the University of Rhode Island, you will have an opportunity to see this. So, how I use film. I use it at the intersection of race, culture, emotion, science, and the environment. I always focus on representation because it's important to show the world that we are here and we are productive and we're dealing with these problems. So I tend to feature people of Latinx, African American, and of indigenous descent in my films. I emphasize subjectivity and emotionality in scientific methods. I use film as a mirror in my science communication classes, to the horror of my graduate students. But I'll show you a clip in a minute and you'll see. And I bring attention to the problem of exclusion. So I don't want to take up any more time. I want to just show a couple of clips. These are going to be very, very short. One of my early films when I came to the University of Rhode Island, I made a film about, I found out one of my colleagues was one of the pioneers of the environmental justice movement. An African American woman, she had recently been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and I had been interested in environmental justice for a long time, but I only knew of a handful of people, and they were all men. I was like, you were a pioneer in this field and nobody knows about you? She's like, yeah, well, you know. I was like, no, yeah, well, you know. We're going to put it on the map, and guess what? Film does that, right? Film has a power that I can't even estimate, honestly. So I made this film in the interest of correcting the errors of the situation, and it ended up being a story about her and her mother. Her mother ended up narrating the story. So let me just show you a clip. So that's her mother. That's her. One of the pioneers of the environmental justice movement.
Seems like now it just slipped up on me. Because looked like I was 70 last week. And all I was here come 90, you know. I don't feel like I'm an old lady. I retired at 80 years old. Come and take care of her. Because when I saw how she was, I didn't think I wanted to leave her here by herself.
That part your life's work. And my assistant has been. That's over. I have no reason for being. But it was almost like, you know, someone had to say, you're finished. For me to then respond and say, no, I don't think so.
This is the Lopez Canyon landfill in the East San Fernando Valley. Garbage trucks from all over the city of Los Angeles dump their load here, more than 1.5 million tons of trash a year. The proposed plant, dubbed Lancer for Los Angeles City Energy Recovery Project, will cost $235 million and burn 1,600 tons of household garbage a day.
We do know what emissions will come out of the smokestack. We do know that dioxins, Agent Orange, that's when we all learned what a
They'll sort of build
it's produced from the burning
place where you bring the trash and dump it.
Zinc, lead,
And it was in the neighborhood where the projects are, so you know who lives there, huh?
vinyl chloride, mercury.
The children didn't need to be exposed to that. Dump trucks coming all up down their street all hours of the day. So since it got busy.
It's an area that has very...
Well, you know, those people come to you, they're educated.
It has
They can out-talk you. Cynthia got her little group together. They out-talk him. But he had to show up.
Okay, so that's from my film, Good Radical. Essentially in the interest of trying to include the role of Black women in the environmental justice movement. So let's move on. The next film, my most recent film, Can We Talk, talks about the issue of exclusion and sense of belonging and the impact and effect that it has on underrepresented people of color. So take a look.
I felt that there was always this assumption that I was dumb, that I was stupid or less than compared to like my classmates. I felt like I always had a chip on my shoulder, like there was something to prove. And I felt like when I came home, it was very different. Like at home, there wasn't this surprise that I was intelligent. It was more of like an expectation. I didn't really get praised much about it at home because it was just, this is what you're supposed to do.
I remember having a college counselor and getting close to college application times and sharing with her that I wanted to go to medical school. And I remember specifically saying to her, mentioning one of the Ivy Leagues that I wanted to go to for medical school, and being met with, oh, you should never apply there because people like you don't get into those schools, so you should just decide to do something else. I think you need to tailor your ambitions more towards this field or the other fields because my dreams, I guess, for her were a little too big.
I walked into the door at University of Maryland to the admissions office to give somebody my application. I filled everything out. I walked up to the desk and I was actually really excited. So I was telling the woman that I had my application, and she just looked at me, and she was a Black woman, and she looked at me and she just, with not even a smile on her face, she said, "What makes you think you would get in here?" And I really just felt uncomfortable. I didn't like the attitude, and I just walked out with my application. I didn't even leave it.
So Georgia Tech was interesting. I got to Georgia Tech on various sets of scholarships, none of which were minority fellowships. Think of Ford Foundation, the Regent Scholarship, then funding from the department. But almost predictably, after a while, I was treated as if I was there on some special accommodation to allow me to be into the program. I was the first African American to get their PhD in the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences program at Georgia Tech.
And I just decided that that wasn't going to be a supportive education for me. Whether she represented it or not, she was the first person I saw, the first person I talked to, and that's pretty powerful. So I just decided, that's that, I don't want to go there.
So it was my second year of my doctoral program in neuroscience, and I was completing my qualifying exam. And so this exam, I had a committee of faculty that were on my exam committee, one of whom I hadn't met before. So we sort of arranged everything by email, and then after I'd written my first draft of the proposal that I was writing for the exam, I had a face-to-face meeting with her for the first time, and she started the meeting by complimenting me on how well written my proposal was, and then proceeded to ask me if I had had help.
When I got to graduate school, I sort of liked what I liked. I was a marine biology researcher, and I kind of liked it with an angle towards conservation. That field is mostly white. Maybe that it sort of jumped at me early, but it's not something that kind of resonated until one year I went to a major academic conference, and before I had to present a poster, I was mistaken for the coffee guy, or part of the wait staff. And I remember, it took like 6 seconds for me to realize what just happened.
I was one of 2 people in the branch at NASA Goddard in Greenbelt, Maryland, working as an atmospheric sciences branch. And I don't believe there were any other African Americans or people of color that I can remember while I was working in the branch at Marshall. At Marshall, a good portion of my early time there, people would ask me to empty the trash in their office. Coffee's out in the break room. Can you need more coffee? And because the help was African American.
I was completely disarmed because I couldn't tell if she was accusing me of cheating on my exam, or if she was trying to, I don't know what she was trying to do. But it made me feel terrible that she didn't, that it didn't occur to her that I would have been a good writer.
I can tell you, first grade, the teacher telling my mother that I'd never really be able to read on on my grade level, that I was not very bright. So it starts from the beginning.
And so that affected my entire process of completing that exam, for both finishing writing it and going through the oral defense of it. And it sort of destabilized me in my program for a long time, because up until then I had been very confident. I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be a neuroscientist since I was in high school, and I did everything right to get to where I wanted to go as a doctoral student. And that was the first time, that I felt that other people were expecting that I shouldn't be there.
So I went to Atlanta from Washington State. In Washington State, I was one of 7 African Americans in my high school, which included my sister. At the time, and I think there was around, it was a large high school, I think it was around 1,000, 1,500 students. So I was an ultra minority in the high school. And one of the things that attracted me to the Atlanta University Center and Complex, Atlanta, was that you don't have to worry about being a minority, being singled out, jokes by the teachers. In high school, I was continually being taken out of the advanced college prep courses and being placed into, wood shop or car shop, Bayesian calculus. He probably doesn't want to do that. He wants to be over here. And it was my mother who would put me back into those classes.
Only 13% of scientists in the U.S. are underrepresented people of color. So some of that data, those stories, help you understand. The stories give you an understanding as to why the numbers are so low, right? I don't think that this should be a shock to most of us. But to be honest with you, one of the people who I interviewed in this film is my sister, and I hadn't heard those stories until I asked her formally. And she said, we don't talk about these things. amongst ourselves even, because we don't want to stop one another from pursuing our dreams. So Vernon Morris, who's a professor at the University of, he's at Howard University right now actually. He's the leading most scholar on atmospheric sciences. He's the one who said he needed to leave Washington State to go to Atlanta because he couldn't handle it anymore, right? So he was at the presentation, we were at AGU, and we showed the film, and his grad students, who've all gone on to great acclaim, stood up and said, Professor Morris, you never told us about your experiences in pursuit of your PhD. And he said, I would never want to scare you away with what happened to me. But his student pushed back and said, but how are we going to learn how to navigate the situation if we don't learn from how you navigated from the situation? We need to be talking in greater detail about these things, even if it causes some emotional ire, right? So before we run out of time, I want to share another experiment that I recently did with my graduate students. Sorry, I don't know how to do this cute note thing.
I felt.
See, clearly I don't. I'm not going to show that. Okay. So the last bit I want to share with you is I teach graduate students from the sciences how to do science communication. And you know, one half of the class is very perfunctory. I'm going to teach you how to write a news article, how to talk to a journalist, how to write a blog post, how to do a news story, how to all that stuff, right? But then I talk to them about themselves and their role in creating space for people of color in the sciences. This is my ethical charge, and it is your ethical charge too. Even if you're not in the sciences, it's your ethical charge. Inclusion is the ethical charge of humans, right? So I use film in my classes as a mirror. So I sit and I interview my students and I learn their story, but I get them to reflect on the role that their personal story plays in their own research, because I want them to be able to see and connect their story and their own emotionality and subjectivity. See, I'm not interested in erasing somebody's subjectivity. I want to bring it out. And then connect it to your science, right? Because that's one of the mechanisms I use to encourage a sense of belonging. Let me tell you, 100% of my students said that they had never been asked what their personal story is, and much less asked, oh, how can we incorporate this into your design of your work? Right? You're indigenous, let's include traditional practices in the lab. Had never been asked. So I asked. And then I filmed them to their horror. And just before I came, I put a little sequence together. This is kind of raw, but I wanted to show you what came out of this.
So on a broad scale, my research has a lot to do with the interactions between the ocean and atmosphere and the chaotic movement of fluid, whether it's water or air, at this boundary. So I wanted to kind of look at that in terms of how it applies to my personal life and maybe society as a whole. Talking about how I'm biracial, half Pakistani, half white, and my parents are Christian and Muslim, and just the kind of the chaotic experiences, I guess, that I've had growing up, and relating that to more of the physical phenomena that we see at the air-sea interface.
So I'm specifically talking about my liminal experience as being a biracial individual. I had always, or as a child mainly, was a bit confused with my identity. I felt as if I grew up in a predominantly white community, and so I always thought I was white, and I was regularly reminded that I wasn't. And so I was sort of forced into this liminal space because people rejected the identity that I wanted to adopt. So that's sort of this theme that I would like to explore, is this forced liminality. And with that, looking at the the people that I study, the Macostarese people of Montezuma, they originally lived in the mainland of South Sulawesi, and during World War II, during the Japanese occupation, they fled to these coral islands to flee persecution and the violence forced into this liminal space by these external forces because they were an ethnic group that was, they weren't Japanese. They weren't part of the people who were trying to occupy this space and use their resources. So because of their identity, they were pushed into this other area. And so I'm trying to make a parallel with that. And so I think a lot of my take home, or the idea that I'm trying to push forward, is the fact that we live in this culture of categories, and if you don't fit into one of them, external forces will try to push you into one.
After I got back from Iraq, my therapist, one of my therapists, the most effective one, told me this story about turtles and how resilient they are, and they have this shell that protects them from predators. So they have this hard exterior, but inside there's something different going on. They're smart and they push through adversity. No matter what's going on around them, they survive. And then it had me thinking about the impact that we have on sea turtles. Not just with overfishing, but with harvesting the eggs. Some cultures harvest the eggs for protein and food sources. But humans have had such a dramatic impact on them, taking away their nesting niches, polluting them, building on them, overfishing, harvesting, boat strikes, the problem with shrimp fisheries, the trawling, things like that. And it just had me thinking about the impact that we have on them, but they are still here, after over 100 million years. They've survived a lot, and it's just inspirational. Think that they could just keep trucking on and make it through everything. So I felt like I needed to do what I could to try to make a difference in that field. Because I just felt like, I was here for a reason. Like, I came home, and a lot of people didn't. And so I felt fortunate enough that I was going to use that to benefit something that really needed my help.
Emotionality is what moves people and what actually makes them listen.
Seeing the emotional side of the scientist makes it more relatable, and I feel like people care more when they see that they're real people. So, this whole overarching thing with the science communication, and it's so important to connect with our communities, and for the most part, we don't seem approachable because we come off as, not everyone, but we tend to come off as rigid and, as my brother said, know-it-alls, but we're really not. We come from somewhere, and there's a reason we're here today doing what we're doing.
Yeah, I guess my emotion is more like this sense of relief. I think that this process has just been, it's emotionally confusing because it's not something that I would typically do or think about. And I expressed this to you previously that, it's just, I guess it's sort of like this enlightening, it's not a sad cry, it's more like finally understanding a lot of things that triggered me. And not only academia within my studies, but just like my personal identity. And it's sort of nice. It's good to reckon with a lot of these things that I probably would have gone a long time without reckoning with.
I think I've known for a while that I've had like a different experience from most of the people here. But I think this class has really and like empowered me to feel comfortable sharing it and letting people know who I actually am instead of feeling like I need to fit into the mold of the students here specifically and also as a scientist as a whole.
So now we have 7 minutes, not to be specific, to chat. I'd love to hear what has bubbled to the surface for you. Thank you so much, Kendall.